If you've ever wondered whether or not you're autistic, you don't need to rush straight to getting an official diagnosis, which would be costly, time-consuming, and maybe not even worth it as an adult. So what should you do instead? There are several tests that you can take online that are statistically significant that will give you a ton of information about yourself, and you can decide where you want to go from there. In this video, I'll share what those tests are, what it's like taking them, and what you can expect from the results. Make sure you stick with me to the end because we'll also talk a little bit about self-diagnosis and what you might want to do after you get your results. So let's get into it. The first test I recommend is the short AQ10. This is the shorter version of the full AQ, which is the second test that I recommend. AQ here stands for Autism Quotient, and both of these tests are designed for adults with average to higher intelligence. The AQ correctly scores autistics, both male and female, higher than neurotypicals. Research shows that the AQ is a quick tool to identify where a person falls on the continuum from autism to neurotypicality. And the AQ10 retains the predictive validity of the full AQ. I would recommend taking the AQ10 first, and then if you want to take the full AQ, you can do that as well. So what's it like taking this test? The test offers 4 answer choices: definitely agree, slightly disagree, or definitely disagree. I found this test a little bit hard to take because some of the questions are so broad, it's hard to answer with a agree or disagree. Also, it's important to note that the slightly or definitely doesn't matter in your answers. The important differentiator is agree or disagree. So that might save you some time because I didn't know that when I was taking it. For this test, any score of 26 or above indicates a presence of autistic traits. And the higher the score, the more autistic traits you have. For the short AQ, an indicator of autism starts at 6 or higher, and for the full AQ, an indicator of autism starts at 32 or higher. Another thing I want to note is that no single test is going to be conclusive. I recommend taking multiple of them because more information is always better. The third test that you can take is called the Aspie quiz. It's also designed for adults with an IQ in the normal range. This test was a little bit hard to take because of the format, but this is my favorite test. The questions here are much easier to understand and answer than the AQ test. The Aspie quiz that I have linked below is version 5. It consists of 120 questions, and it gives you 4 answer choices: don't know, no/never, a little, or yes/often. The output from this test is really interesting because it tests for both neurotypical and neurodivergent traits in 5 categories: talent, perception, communication, relationships, and social. The rating for this test gives you a score from 0 to 200, and it also gives you a probability of being atypical, which would be neurodivergent or autistic, or typical, which would be neurotypical. The autistic threshold for this test is 35, and that accurately confirms 80% of diagnosed level 1 autistics. Also note that the Aspie quiz is particularly prone to outliers, so you may score below the autism threshold on this test, but score as autistic on other tests. The creators of this test have also noted that version 5 tends to yield lower scores overall than version 4. The next test I recommend isn't actually a test for autism, it's for monotropism, which is a common way of thinking for people with ADHD and autism. Monotropism can be described as a cognitive strategy that causes a person to focus on a small number of interests at any given time, while ignoring things outside of that focus. It's also a thinking and processing style that involves paying deep attention to a few things that are interesting or motivating. I want to be clear that this is not a diagnostic test, but it is a great one to take whether or not you have ADHD or autism, because it can tell you more about your style of thinking. This test is a list of statements that you rate from strongly disagree to strongly agree, and it does include an NA option as well. The output for this test is a score out of 235, and it rates you against the baseline of the initial validation study. So taking this test was hilarious for me because I actually found myself laughing out loud at how much some of the questions described my experience. And it's really cool because it tells you where you fall compared to other people in the validation study. So they told me that I am 83% more monotropic than other autistic people and 99% more monotropic than allistic people. I found that really interesting. The next test you can take is called the RADS-R. I really debated including this one because I absolutely hated taking it. The questions are incredibly confusing. Some of them are really inappropriately worded, but it is designed to identify autistic people who escape diagnosis due to a subclinical level presentation. So I thought it was important to include. If your scores are borderline on some of the other tests, this would definitely be a good one to take. This test is designed for adults who are over the age of 16 with ASD level 1 or subclinical autism. This test assesses the developmental symptoms correlating with the 3 DSM-5 diagnostic categories: language, social relatedness, and sensory motor, as well as a 4th subscale, circumscribed interests. It consists of 80 statements giving you 4 choices for each statement: true now and when I was young, true now only, true only when I was younger than 16, or never true. For this test, the mean score of autism is 130. Like I said, I really hated taking this test, but if you are on the border or questioning a diagnosis, this would be a good one for you to take for sure. And finally, the last 2 tests I recommend are tests for empathy. So the first test is the empathy quotient. The empathy quotient tests for cognitive empathy, and it is designed for autistic adults with a normal IQ range. There are also versions for adolescents and children that are available. The empathy quotient consists of 60 statements giving you 4 answer choices for each statement: definitely agree, slightly disagree, and definitely disagree. The score is from 0 to 80. And the threshold for autism in this test is 30 or below. 81% of people who have been previously diagnosed score 30 or lower. Most non-autistic males score an average of 42, and most non-autistic females score an average of 47. It's important to note that this is a test for cognitive empathy, which is your ability to pick up and understand someone else's mental state. So it's more so testing for social cue awareness, which we know is lower in autistic people. It is not testing for affective empathy, which is your ability to actually empathize with someone else. This is also why I recommend taking the Toronto Empathy Questionnaire, which does test for affective empathy. And it's really common for people who are autistic to score low in cognitive empathy, but above average in affective or emotional empathy. The Toronto Empathy Questionnaire is just 16 questions, and you have 5 answer choices: never, rarely, sometimes, often, and always. The output for the Toronto Empathy Questionnaire is out of a possible 64. Scores that are 45 or above are indicative of above average empathy levels. So those are the 7 tests that I wanted to share with you. If you think you might be autistic, I recommend taking them. Remember that no one test is going to be 100% conclusive. So I really recommend taking all of them and using the results to learn more about yourself and decide where you want to go from there. Now that you know which tests to take, let's talk a little bit about self-diagnosis. First of all, self-diagnosis is recognized within the autism community. If you're an adult who has not formally been diagnosed with autism, self-diagnosis is likely going to be the first way that you identify as an autistic person. As an adult with autism, there aren't really a lot of benefits to an official diagnosis. Plus, it's incredibly expensive, it's a really long wait list, and a lot of clinicians only diagnose kids and not adults. Along with there being no real social support, there is no medication or cure for autism anyways. So personally, I see an autism diagnosis as an important step for self-awareness. Knowing that you have autism is what is important about the diagnosis, not the fact that a clinician has recognized and validated autism within you. Like I said at the beginning of this, these tests are statistically significant, especially if you take all of them. You could safely self-diagnose yourself with autism without feeling like you are identifying with a label that you shouldn't have. If all of these tests show that you are likely autistic, it is perfectly safe for you to assume that label for yourself, figure out what it means for you and what you want to do with it. My autism diagnosis was such an important step in self-awareness for me because having that label meant that I could understand myself better. I could understand how I fit in the world better, the reasons that I struggle with certain things that other people don't. While it was somewhat difficult for me to integrate into my self-identity, it was incredibly important to my mental health. I burn out less now because I accommodate myself more. I have been able to recognize when I'm masking and consciously unmask when situations are safe to do so. And that's helped me immensely, again, with burnout and with just liking myself more and showing up more authentically in the world. Another important thing I want to highlight here. Research shows that 1 in 4 children with autism go undiagnosed. So it's not an uncommon experience to have a missed diagnosis in childhood and be diagnosed later in life or as an adult. That goes back to my point of self-diagnosis. If you were not diagnosed as a child, your first step to realizing you're autistic is likely going to be a self-diagnosis. And when there are very little support for autistic adults, sometimes it's really not going to make sense for you to seek an official diagnosis, which is why self-diagnosis is accepted within the autism community. So if that is you, just know that you're not alone and we're all here on this journey to support each other and grow. So if you're just now getting these results and realizing that you're probably autistic, what should you do next? The first thing I recommend is to learn a little bit more about autism and understand the ways that it shows up in your life. If you're just realizing you have autism, but you know you have ADHD or think you have ADHD, I would recommend this video here where I talk about the similarities and contradictions between both autism and ADHD. See if you relate, and I'll see you in the next video.